Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Ross Virginia. I'm a member of the Environmental Studies Program faculty and I'm the director of the Institute of Arctic Studies, and we're delighted to have you here today. Today's lecture is sponsored by the Institute of Arctic Studies, and it's a contribution to our Polar Environmental Change Graduate Program lecture series called Dialogues in Polar Science and Society. And one of the themes that we stress in this graduate program is science communication and the need for the sciences, the arts, bringing together writers, scientists, performers in new collaborations to think about how we can communicate our ideas and our knowledge and our emotions around environmental change and climate change. So we're very pleased to have sort of a two-part presentation, one starting today. We have writer and environmental activist Rick Bass with us. But I want to just take a second to highlight a film that we're going to be showing in this same room tomorrow at 4:30. We have Karsten Huer here, who works with his wife, Canadian filmmaker Leanne Allison. And I think many of you know their work from the delightful film Being Caribou. And they have a new film that they've produced, and it's called Finding Farley. And Farley is Farley Mowat, who most of us recognize as just an amazing Canadian writer who has done so much to enrich the literature about the far north and is really an icon of Canadian identity. And Farley invited Karsten and Allison to meet with him. And they decided, okay, well, let's make an adventure out of this. So they trekked 5,000 kilometers. I've got to get into the Canadian metric system here. 5,000 kilometers across Canada to find Farley. And they did this with their young child and their dog, and much of it by canoe. And along the way, they filmed this adventure. And so we'll be able to meet with Karsten. He's going to show the film. It's about 60 minutes long. It's a beautiful film, and I encourage you all to be with us tomorrow. So the main feature today is we're going to be talking about the power of the written word and the relationship of the written word to environmental activism. And I don't think there's anyone who better identifies with excellence and productivity in both areas than writer Rick Bass. Rick is perhaps our best recognized, I think, nature writer right now, is also very engaged in activism and the wilderness, the struggle for preserving wilderness. He was born in Texas, and his father was a geologist, as I recall. And I imagine he had a terrific rock collection as a young man, because he went on to study geology at Utah State. And shortly after that went on and began working as a petroleum geologist in Mississippi. And shortly after that, though, he decided to move on from there to the place that's captured his heart and his energy, and that's the state of Montana. And he's lived in a place called the Yak Valley for 20 plus years with his family and his wife, who's an artist, Elizabeth Hughes Bass. He's become very deeply engaged with the problems of the ways in which we fragment landscapes through building roads and dividing up wilderness and chopping our land into smaller and smaller pieces to the point where it loses its special identity and many of the properties that, as an ecosystem ecologist, I attribute to ecosystem functioning. It's not just what it looks like, but it's actually how it works. In addition, so through his writing, he's become involved in the preservation movement for wilderness in the western states. And I think when you hear his words, you'll see how he can connect these two themes together. He's written over 20 books, and many of these have received various awards. And in reading particularly his works about Montana, it brings to mind another great writer and a scientist and author, and that's Jared Diamond, who's written the book Collapse. And Jared Diamond, in this book Collapse, looks at all the reasons why societies have failed through history. And the main theme that comes out of this over and over again, it's fundamentally about the human relationship with land and the way we treat land and the way we identify with land. And he relates that to the collapse of the Norse, and he relates that to the collapse of the Maya civilization, and it's a very big, fat book with many, many, many examples. But if you pick up that book and you open it to the very first chapter, the title of the chapter is Under Montana's Sky. So this is where it starts, and I think that when you meet Rick and hear his words about the places that he's engaged with, think about that. What is our relationship with that land, and what does it mean if we want to sustain our land and society? He's received many awards for his writings and his books. In fact, his first short story, The Watch, was probably where it began. He wrote that on his breaks while he was working as a geologist. It won an award, and I think he just kept writing and thinking and writing and working to preserve lands. In searching through some of Rick's works, and I think we may hear from one that I teach from some, because I work in Arctic systems and tundra and think about caribou and the wild animals of the north. But I did run across an essay about our Montana, and that's the Northern Forest. And it was a piece that was in Orion magazine. It was published in 2005, I think, let's see here, January and February. And the title is From Paradise Lost. And in it, he talks about our need to think big and act on behalf of our ecosystems, on behalf of the wilderness. And there were a couple sentences in here that kind of jumped out at me as I rediscovered this essay in thinking about your visit here. And the lines are this: the value of a larger dream, then, is that it encourages boldness and possesses at its heart an irreducible element of security and sanctity and reverence, of order amid chaos. And no dream is too large. So I encourage us all to think and dream, and that no dream is too large, and we'll hear more about this from our speaker. Please join me in a warm welcome for Mr. Rick Bass.
Thanks so much, Ross. Appreciate the introduction. Everybody's so busy, and it's hard to write introductions, and they have the shelf life of a mayfly. I mean, you wrote it, you labored over it, you researched it, you said it, and now it's gone, and it's just a leaf down the stream.
I'm gonna take my notes out.
Okay. Thank you for for that work. Thank you all for having me in here. I'd like to read. It's funny what you're talking about, landscape and how what our relationship is to it. I've been thinking about that. Everybody's thought about that forever, but I've been thinking about it a lot these days, and more so than ever. And the piece I want to read tonight is set up in the Arctic. I was an oil and gas geologist, and also I'm a hunter, and so that's kind of like strike one and strike two as an environmentalist. And but it kind of a non-traditional identity gives me some insights or avenues, often into enemy camp, I suppose, for lack of better phrasing. And I went up to the Arctic back when Bush and Cheney were trying so hard to open it up for drilling, open the refuge for drilling. And I thought, well, that'll be a different perspective. You have a geologist, an oil and gas geologist, arguing to not open it, and then to go hunting with some of the First Nations folks up there, the Gwich'in. And that's what this book is about, is going up there with my oil and gas maps and my rifle to say, no, don't drill here. You were talking a little bit, Ross, about con bio and island biogeography, and how the best way to protect the landscape is for it to be big and round, and the disintegrating forces of the world, the erosional forces against ecosystem integrity, are going to come from on the perimeter first, and that's why you want something with as little surface area as possible, so you can defend the least amount of surface area, which is a sphere, on that mass. And obviously that's what fragmentation does, is increase surface area, making it harder to defend the same volume against all of these intrusions. I want to come back to that idea, but another thing that scientists are really talking about these days, it's really exciting. My generation learned about the food pyramid, the energy pyramid. Like, here's the base, here's the sun up here, the trophic level starts up here. You've got this massive biomass down here. Your secondary, tertiary predators are at the very top. The most inefficient utilizers of energy are up here. The megafauna. You may have 10 million of this organism, and you may have 10 or 12 of this organism, a grizzly, a killer whale, you know, a big carnivorous megafauna that eats things, that eat things, that eats things. And it was taught in my generation that the foundation controls this, that this megafauna up here, even though it's on the pinnacle of the trophic level, is vulnerable and susceptible. If you cut out this part of the foundation, the pyramid collapses and this species goes extinct by taking away some tiny little krill or something. And now what some thinkers are thinking, which is really exciting, well, it's not that simple. The pyramid works both ways. This giant, you know, the rhino, the bison with its massive consumption of energy, you know, not a predator, of course, but grizzlies, et cetera, that they have a huge influence on the middle and lower level trophic system. And if you knock them out, then this stuff loses its relationship to the world, this important baseline stuff. So back to, you know, it's looking at the same story upside down, and I think both stories are correct scientifically. So this roundness idea, you know, you've got a big wild landscape. What's in the center there? We know what we lose here at the edges. The dandelions come in, the fire ants come in, but what kind of things are at the heart of wild country of unparalleled ecological integrity? Well, this guy that I want to read about tonight, I think he's one of those things that's way in there in the center of that backcountry. I mean, and it's a strange, that may be strike three against me, to consider that you know, a species as noxious as ourselves could have such an important placement in the center of something as you know, magnificent and spiritual as wilderness. But this guy, hanging out with him that I'm going to read about, makes me wonder, you know, maybe there are some among our species who are so much more rank and different than the main flow of us. In rarity, there's usually value. And I guess that's what I'm stumbling over trying to say. Just bumping into this guy on the river, he was a rough customer, and he was not like really anybody that I hang out with. And I think somehow intuitively, instinctively, I think this guy is really important to who we are, and not just who we are, but who we're becoming. I don't mean we should all become like him. I just mean he's kind of like somehow he's kind of way out here on the edge of things on this plan view of the pyramid, and on this bird's eye view, he's in there in the center, and that's his rarity should be a concern, I think. Although if there were a lot of people like him, we'd be in a world of hurt for different reasons, which will become evident. You know, I don't mean to romanticize him. I think that was one of the important things about this trip was, you know, having it reiterated. Okay, the native folks up here in Arctic Village, I mean, they need their machines, they need their oil and gas. You know, meat is meat. There's not the romantic transcendentalist view of you know, our furred and feathered friends up there. It's truly subsistence, and it was good for me to see that in a way I still don't quite understand. So the backstory: I'm going up with an acquaintance upriver, and we're looking for caribou. And this other band, these 4 hunters, have been out looking for caribou, and people think they're lost. Nobody knows where they didn't show up back in camp, and so people are worried. We call them the Lost Boys. The Lost Boys nearly collide with us as they come drifting silently around a bend, right in our lane, the only lane on the river. There are 4 of them, and they are dressed in camouflage, sunburned and vacant-eyed, and as haggard gets, and they do not look the least bit happy to see my pale face sitting in the bow of our boat, rounding the corner and right upon them. They scowl blankly at us for a long time, as if believing we are but a hallucination, a time warp. And I likewise am shocked, for they look exactly like the gunboat crew in the movie Apocalypse Now. And for 2 or 3 long moments I forget that they are the men we have been looking for, and believe them instead to be pirates, buccaneers who are stunned and made motionless by our sudden appearance, blundering into their midst as we are, but to whom the old memories of plunder and piracy will soon return. As if rousing themselves from a deep, deep dream, they finally begin to stir. They squint. Never have I seen such a malevolent-looking crew, such marauders. And then, recognizing Charlie, their features seem to soften ever so slightly, as if they have decided to kill and eat only me, but will spare Charlie and old Alan. And wordlessly we pull abreast with them, one boat going downriver, the other upriver, and silently old Alan tosses them a rope, which they fasten to their boat, as if this is a drill they have rehearsed many times before. Old Alan reaches into the pocket of his overalls and pulls out his box of Marlboros, and still wordlessly he begins tossing cigarettes to each of the broken sailors, one by one, who only now become animated, smiling and even laughing through cracked and parched lips. The one who will introduce himself as Mike grins wider and tells us that, while watching our approach, they were deathly afraid our boat was being piloted by the one man in the village who doesn't smoke cigarettes. "Oh, fuck, that's Jim Hollingsworth. He ain't got no cigarettes," is what Mike told the others. He laughs, seemingly awestruck by his good fortune, adrift and ragged in one moment, and now enjoying a good smoke on a lovely winding river in the next. Two of the other compatriots, Walter and Jonathan, look to my civilized and sissified eyes like ordinary run-of-the-mill desperados. It is the fourth of their party, Jimmy, whose visage so startled me initially, and who even now, grinning with his cigarette, what generosity! Old Alan was down to his last handful. Still looks not so much like a member of this expedition, but instead like some wild thing they have captured far upriver and whom they are ferrying back to Arctic Village, a specimen. Like something they might have caught in a net. Like someone they might have hazed and herded into a corral or tricked into a snare. He's wearing camo pants, a camo jacket, and old high-top tennis shoes so loosely laced and untied that they might as well have no laces at all. His face, weathered and coppery. Later, I'll be surprised to find out he's 39. Unlike most Gwich'in, he looks his age or close to it. Has more strongly pronounced Mongolian features, so much so that at first I have trouble thinking of him as one of the four hunters. Instead, in every way, he seems to stand apart from the others, and it's easy to imagine that in his nomadic travels, his hunts, he has immigrated here from Central Asia just in the past few years, rather than through the blood of his ancestors so many thousands of years ago. Even though that country is much the same as this country, he appears to have retained far more of that old land's signature. And perhaps, paradoxically, he seems also to be more closely hewn to this landscape, a throwback even among the ancients. Are there certain individuals who are more susceptible to being carved by landscape? Are such individuals important to our society? And from a human rights standpoint, do they have an inalienable right to inhabit those landscapes? And what of the landscapes themselves? The carvers, not the carved. Why this antagonism toward their power and majesty? Why this childishness and reluctance? Why this stubborn need to try to disempower and even kill one wild and vital landscape after another? It turns out that Jimmy is the one who broke their boat, running it hard through the shallows. He's forthright in telling us he was going too fast, and he marvels at it, as if surprised by his own zeal to get up into the mountains to hunt. And somehow I gather that it's not the first time he's run the boat aground. There are two kinds of men in the world, two kinds of women or children also, the neat and precise, and the unneat, the imprecise. And while clearly Charlie and old Alan are the former, it is just as clear to me that Jimmy is not. The decision is made to go back up river a ways, drop off Alan and me at an intermediate camping spot, and then Charlie will take the others all the way back to Arctic Village. There's barely enough daylight left to do this. Charlie will be back first thing in the morning, 6:30 he says, to pick us up, and then we'll continue on up the river to the kids' camp that Charlie's setting up to check it out and to look for caribou. As we motor slowly back upriver, the two boats rigged together like a catamaran, and with the one faltering little motor laboring harder than ever, the crew of river drifters begins to recover, their spirits refreshed by the new company and by the gift of the cigarettes. I got to face my Auntie Sarah, Jimmy says. speaking of Sarah James, whom I gather owns some part of the boat, perhaps even the motor itself, with the propeller and entire lower shaft now so thoroughly devastated by the impulsiveness, the completeness of Jimmy's desire to get upriver to the game, to get upriver to the game quickly. Charlie asked the sojourners if they saw any sign of game upriver, and they shake their heads and grumble and reply, "Bear, only bears, lots of bears." There is, in fact, a consensus on this. All four of them seem impressed by the amount of bear sign they saw, and by the fact that the bears came walking right on through camp. And the men mention again that all they had to eat up there was the fish Jimmy could catch. Fish, fish, boiled fish. So that I'm left unavoidably with the image of the camp they have just left, the camp to which we are traveling, being one that is reeking of fish juice, which is drawing all the autumn-hungry bears down out of the mountains. And though I would love to see a bear or bears on this trip, something about the skittishness of even these veteran woodsmen on the subject stills my heart for a moment, then gets it going a little faster than it was before. "Lot of bears up there," Mike says for the fourth time, and shrugs. "Lot of fish." Except for one big pike, he tells us, and all the men except Jimmy laugh. Jimmy, in fact, who had previously been grinning during even the discussion of the damage to the engine, begins to glower. The change is not subtle, not insignificant. His deep brown skin seems to grow darker, and his narrow eyes even more so. There is a stillness and a resolve that comes over him. Am I imagining this? Though after a few moments he pretends to laugh too. However, an actor he is not. It turns out there had been a big pike hanging out just off the sandbar by camp, a pike that kept shredding Jimmy's line and leader, until finally the great fish had stolen all his hooks and nipped off with its sharky teeth the last of his line. The other men appeared delighted, in a good-natured way, that any denizen of the animal world had outwitted Jimmy, even if only for the time being. And again, is it my imagination, or is Jimmy only 2 ticks away from vaulting out of the broken boat and thrashing his way through the shallows all the many miles back upstream for a return engagement encounter with the thieving green speckled sea monster? Mike informs me about some of Jimmy's hunting escapades from earlier in the summer. Jimmy had come around the bend of the river, Mike tells us, and had seen a herd of musk oxen standing at shore's edge. Musk oxen, an endangered species, are slowly dispersing southward. Biologists don't know why. And though they haven't ever been seen this far south, there they were, right in front of the one person they least needed to encounter. They were the first musk oxen Jimmy had ever seen, so that perhaps for a moment he might have thought them to be beautiful mythical creatures from a dream or from some lower depth, some substratum of the spirit world, even further down than the levels in which he usually communed and traveled and hunted. But if this were his reaction, it appears not to have interfered with his trigger finger. For by the time he had finished shooting and the other musk oxen had bolted back into the willows, 3 lay dead on the beach. Nearly a ton of meat, just like that, almost instantaneously gifted. How can you not believe in a spirit world in a world like that? Jimmy packed them up, feeling proud and feeling blessed, I would guess, and, not knowing they were protected, was so pleased with this bounty that he cooked one of the animals at a wedding in the village. He got popped, Mike says cheerfully, speaking of the jail time Jimmy had to serve. Tasted good, though, better than beef. Wild, he says. They were perhaps the first people in their village to eat muskox in 30 years, perhaps the first since their village settled down to deal with the fur traders 150 years ago. Time like a river, wandering and meandering, surging and reversing, forward and back. On the Chandelar, our strange and cheerful limping little procession of injured boats reaches the tiny bluff where we're going to make camp for the night, while Charlie and the others head back down to the village. Our camping spot is more of a high-cut bank than a bluff, but there are a few spruce trees. We're very near the foot of the mountains. And while we are coasting into shore in the softening twilight of early evening, my gaze is drawn toward 2 soft hills, side by side, lying slightly north. When I ask my host what the names for those hills are, the 2 significant peaks resting in a saddle between the larger mountains, They each shrug and say that there is no name. I'm sure they're mistaken. It's just too pronounced of a landform to not have a name, too pronounced to not be central. Maybe they're not seeing what I'm pointing at. Those two dots, I say, the ones standing out there all by themselves. Oh, those, Mike says. I guess we call those the two-dot hills. The change in all the men is noticeable to me once we make our landfall. They relax even further, and I'm reminded again that despite their familiarity and expertise with the river, most of the times they are hunters, not fishermen or boat people. The men busy themselves in all directions at once, setting up tents against the swarming insects, building a fire, gathering wood, and preparing supper. For the first time since my arrival, I feel the complete absence of angst, a complete feeling of freedom and fit among the hunters, and I can only imagine how this must be even accentuated on those evenings when they have an animal down in camp. Alan, far and away the oldest, seems suddenly 15 years younger, and though not suddenly garrulous, he spends several minutes hunting for a root that can be eaten for its sugar, and shows us another plant that is like a version of Labrador tea. He makes a pot with it right then and there to demonstrate, and it is delicious, strong, and very green and biting, with an edge of licorice. The other travelers lounge around with their backs propped against the trunks of the tiny trees, smoking their cigarettes and slowly fanning away the swarming insects. And Mike takes me over to the edge of the trees and points to a wide marshy lake on the other side of the forest, in which swim two giant snow-white trumpeter swans. They are ruddering around in leisurely, elegant, skater-like movements, and in that dimming, coppery sun, against the backdrop of these mountains, it is like something from a fairy tale. Mike watches them for long moments. I think he is about to utter something reflective, even poetic, and so I am surprised when he nods toward the swans and says, "Cost me 5 years in the slammer." He pauses, then adds, "and $5,000. We wander back to camp. Alan, acting almost sprightly, has chopped down some dead spruce saplings for the fire, and we help drag those back and pile them on bit by bit, and then sit around the smoking fire in dusk, visiting and relaxing. I notice that all around us are little hacked-down stubs and stumps of saplings, indicating that although this is no formal camp and has no name, generations of Gwich'in have stopped here on nights just like this one. Jimmy is particularly silent, almost trance-like, watching the fire. And I have to wonder if he's busy trying to summon a moose or a caribou, the path of that animal being altered even in the moment, this evening, up in the mountains, and initiating a change in its movements. In both of their movements, Jimmy's and the animals, that will allow their paths to intersect tomorrow, or the next day, or the next. Or if he was dreaming of the big hook-stealing pike, his memories tinged with the borderline blood hues of smoldering rage. Instead, he rubs his eyes after long moments and asks Charlie if he has any aspirin. Charlie nods and goes down to the boat and brings back his first aid kit, which he leaves with us, though not after first taking out a little plastic jar of Motrin and saying, "Not my Motrin, you can't have my Motrin." Did I really expect them to grub roots and gnaw bark, given a choice? What could be more simple, more wonderful after a long hot day of labor, almost fruitless labor, on the blazing bright river, than an aspirin and an upright tree against which to lean one's back? Charlie rises. He stayed too long, which means he'll have to navigate the lower stretch of the river in darkness, after the sun has gone down, but before the moon rises, though he's not overly concerned. It's a route he's run hundreds of times, and he gathers the others and quietly, with an absence of official or even semi-official farewells or calls of goodbye, our camp separates, cleaves in two, the campers remaining and the other hunters continuing downstream into that blue dusk in the ailing boat. If anyone cries out, "Goodbye," or "Take care," I do not hear it, nor do I see even a wave, And it occurs to me that perhaps this is how it was in the earlier centuries, during nomadic times, with bands and clans and clusters breaking apart briefly and drifting in different wandering directions before reforming again, not unlike the herds of caribou themselves. Old Allen, young again, wanders the bluff with his rifle slung over his shoulders, scraping the whitened bone of a moose's shoulder blade against limbs and tree trunks, making a sound that is supposed to imitate the noise a bull moose makes, rubbing the velvet from his early autumn antlers as he scrapes young trees in similar fashion, marking with visual signposts the borders of his territory. Old Allen is hoping that a nearby bull will think he's an interloper and will come charging in, wanting to fight. For this reason, the men used an axe rather than the chainsaw when cutting up wood for the fire, and it pleases me to realize that, even in what I perceive to be a deeper state of relaxation for them, they are still, perhaps more than ever, focused upon what they came for. After darkness, Allen comes to the fire briefly and smokes a cigarette, then retires to his tent, and it's just me and the village's number one hunter sitting by the fire, staring at the coals and the flames and the wisping ribbons of gray smoke. And again it feels as if, in traveling such a distance in miles, I have also traveled some distance in time. Again, for the 1000th time, I find myself getting angry at Bush and Cheney for their unwillingness to try to either understand or protect the refuge and its caribou and the calving grounds, and for their stubborn inability to understand how rare this is. Jimmy is still staring at the fire and ruminating about the consequences of his bad fortune. I was wondering why Auntie asked if we had just one engine, he says, speaking of when they first headed upriver into the shallows in a drought year to go hunting. He shrugs as if speaking to the fire or to another personage inside himself, or even to some unseen third interlocutor. It doesn't bother me, he says. I've got $3,000. He reflects about other mishaps, about a time he was up here on his snowmobile in winter and his machine broke. That was a long-ass walk, man, he says. One he barely made that time. Bedraggled and freezing, he walked up to a pack of wolves right out in the middle of a frozen lake before he realized what they were. I jumped in the snow and dug a little den. They passed by, he says. And after they went past him, he jumped up and started running. He's not a man to be afraid of any part of nature, but he tells me of a time hunting up on one of the side tributaries, also in winter, when he and a couple of companions were approached by a pack of 75 to 100 wolves. And as Jimmy tells it, the wolves' intent was not friendly, and he had to fire at them to turn them back. It's not always this way, of course, but he says it was that once. The fire and my questions bring back other memories of meat, the meat he has provided for the village, unscrolling, again like vapors, like smoke, the lives of all the animals on whose backs the village is carried, reappearing to him perhaps, or to me at least in the listening. He's killed 14 black ducks in one shot, he says, and I have to assume he doesn't mean on the fly. The muskox he killed, he said he was given 5 days jail time in addition to the $1,000 fine, but that he left jail after only a couple of days. I can't quite follow the logistics of what he's telling me, but what it sounds like to me is that he basically forfeited his bond in order to get out a few days early. There were some wild sheep he killed another time that he wasn't supposed to. That cost him $625, he says mildly, as if merely remembering a string of bad luck rather than any sequences of events that were the result of his own choosing. The lakes are drying out, he says, not judgmentally, but simply observing it as he might a shift in the direction of the wind. It's not the same the way it used to be. It's changing. More fire staring, and then a quick glance at me, the representative from outside. Is $3,000 a lot of money, he asks. Later into the night, Jimmy tells me that some nights he'll stay up by the fire late, nearly all night, drinking tea and listening for moose. I've fed a lot of people, he says. 48 scooters, a kind of duck, right here, he says, nodding to Swan Lake. Gathering, he says. He tells me about following caribou on his snow machine near here, back in the spruce forest, when all of a sudden there were caribou all around him. Caribou not running from his approach, but turning around and running at him and leaping past in all directions. The sound of his machine had pushed them into an old caribou fence, left over, he says, from the old ones. Back then, 100 years ago or 1,000, they had built a kind of corral in the forest, in a place where the herds traditionally migrated. The fence was like a kind of tunnel, a funnel, or maze, so that the caribou didn't realize at first they were becoming trapped. Though once inside, they would become disoriented and cornered and were easier to kill. There are still parts of the fence standing, Jimmy says, pointing several miles east, and it was through this ancient corridor that he had inadvertently pushed the caribou. Once more, the shape of the land intersecting still with and relating to the blood lines of those same caribou. Different caribou, hundreds of years later, but still the same. As if the blood within them was somehow but one continuous river or lake, unbroken through time. I ask him if there are any younger people in the village interested in taking on his way of life, his mantle, of village provider, and he rises briefly from his reverie, his communion, and scoffs. Whoever invented Game Boy, he says, and then lets the thought sink, unfinished, unformed, as if unworthy. Then he resurfaces. How can they be so insane, he asks, shooting people in a game? More inventory after letting the troubling image of Game Boy youth pass on. We shot 16 caribou up on that mountain, he says, pointing to a star-backed skyline. A long time ago. There were 4 or 5 of us. It was a big herd, maybe 1,000. Glory days. He tells me the name of the mountain, pronounces it in that clicking, guttural, emphatic dialect of consonants. Did anyone teach you to hunt, I ask, and he shrugs, searches his past, and says, no, I just picked it up. I asked Jimmy if anyone gardens now in Arctic Village. It would seem an ideal location with that black soil and rich all-day summer light for root crops and lettuce. He says that no, some of the old ones used to, but that there aren't any gardens now. We talk about bears for a while, or rather I ask questions about bears. Hardly anyone has mentioned them, which seems odd to me. Caribou, moose, ducks, fish, ptarmigan. There is almost no animal that is not braided into conversation over the course of the day, but in many ways the bears have seemed in these conversations almost like ghosts, working only at the far edges of things, more felt or sensed than seen or heard. I mentioned that only recently have biologists down where I live discovered the surprising extent to which grizzlies are active in winter, coming out of their dens and walking around in the snow for a while like sleepwalkers, or perhaps even feeding on meat as they can. And Jimmy nods and says he's seen that. He'll be out on snowshoes and come across their icy tracks. Why do they do that, he asks, speaking more to himself. Maybe to chill their blood, he says, to aid in hibernation. It's a theory I've never heard, but it makes sense to me. For underground, in their insulated burrow, it would seem the problem would not be getting too cold, but rather too warm, and disrupting, perhaps, the crystalline shell of that mysterious equilibrium. Jimmy explains the reticence among Gwich'in about the subject. When we talk about bears too much, they come and bother us, he says, and I backpedal and apologize, but it's all right. He's willing in a leisurely, cautious way. He accidentally pissed on a bear's signpost tree one night, he says, outside his camp. It was dark and he didn't realize what he'd done until the next morning. The only game Jimmy had was 15 grayling he'd caught, and that next night he hung them by the fire and slept lightly to guard against the bear. But when he awoke the next morning, he discovered that the bear had come into camp and eaten the skin off of each of those fish right next to Jimmy, and Jimmy had never heard a thing, as if a spell had been cast. I've never shot a bear in my life, Jimmy says. He and another hunter watched a Dall sheep cross the river not far from here, crossing the random braided maze of exposed stones and cobbles, fleeing them on a dead run. Real fast, Jimmy says, like he was flying. After the animal had escaped, Jimmy and his friend went down to the river to try and track him, and were astounded to see that not a single hoof had touched the water. Every stone was dry. Even walking carefully, slowly, they couldn't keep from wetting their own feet. His thoughts seemed to skip around like the flashing feet of the wild sheep crossing that improbable mosaic of cobble shining dry in the middle of the broad, rushing river. I don't like it, those sport hunters coming around here, he says, just here for a trophy, no meat. A few seconds later, he is farther across the river. Gideon and Moses have lost their boats too, he says, as if consoling himself. Their motors went out too. Silence then. I ask about his camouflage clothing, if he was ever in the service. Yes, he says, but with a strange smile he tells me they wouldn't let him stay. I was a bad boy, he says, and I don't ask how, but am instead reminded again of him forfeiting his bail to get out of jail 2 days early. Jimmy yawns. Is it midnight or 3 a.m., closer to dawn? He nods toward his tent, which seems perched precariously close to the edge of the bluff. He likes to sleep right by the river, he says, so that if he hears a moose crossing the river in the night, he can jump up and go after it. He says he can tell by the change in the river's music, the harmonics is how he describes it, when an animal is crossing. He imitates perfectly for me the sound that rises above the lulling background sound of the river when that happens, a deep, stealthy, glottal, popping chum, chum. Jimmy seems to live only in the near past, the hunting past, and no further into the future than the next day's hunt. What he will not tell me, either because he does not seem to think it's that important or extraordinary, or perhaps even because he does not recall any of it, remembers nothing of his childhood or his existence up until the time he made his first kill, is that, on the day he was born, he was chosen to be the village's hunter. Charlie's wife, Marion, will tell me all of this upon my return to Arctic Village, and when she does, I will be astounded by the puzzle-perfect way the pieces of his identity, his life, fall together, as well as by the fact that such a thing is still done in this day and age and in this big country, this big nation. The village assigned him that responsibility, that lifelong calling, and began training him for it from the beginning. The culture, the community, shaping this one man in the course of only a few years, as the landscape had shaped their culture over the past 20,000, or even as the caribou themselves had been sculpted to fit this land over the past 100,000. How can any Western notions of time survive in the face of such dynamics? As soon as Jimmy could walk, the Gwich'in elders gave him a little pack and told him that he should never, ever let it be empty, that he should always have something in it that he'd gathered, even if it was just the guts, the stomach of something, and that for practice, whenever he encountered a village elder, he should then offer them whatever was in his little pack, whatever he'd been able to scrounge or gather. It was to train him, Marion says, to never go out and come back barehanded, empty-handed. She says that even when nobody goes out, too cold or no game, he goes out and brings in food, like a magician, a shaman, or sorcerer, to sculpt him from the very beginning into the habit of giving, of providing. He used to haul wood and sell wood, she says, and again he would be sure that the elders were kept in a good supply of wood. If the chainsaw didn't work, says Marion, he would use an axe. They never had to ask, she says. It was his habit. He noticed things, she says, and would get wood for anybody who needed it, or meat, too. He'd do the same thing over and over again, sawing or chopping and hauling wood or bringing in game until everyone was set and satisfied. When people are hungry, she says, he feeds them. He can't be in the village long, she says. He doesn't like it. She shakes her head. He can't stay here. He doesn't visit much with the village. That's just how he is. He saved a lot of people, she says. When they're lost, he goes and finds them. When they drown, he puts them back alive through artificial resuscitation. His paternal grandfather was none other than Old John himself, for whom Old John Lake was named, a hunter and a fisherman and a nomad of the old school, who still wore skin clothes up until the 1990s and who would follow the caribou on foot, ceaselessly following them, Marion says, as far as they would go sometimes. right out to the edges of infinity and eternity, right out past the last wall and fence of time and into whatever space, whatever territory lies beyond that last low wall. Thank you all for coming in, listening. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions about being up north or heck, anything down in Montana or anywhere.
We're taping this, so we have a couple of microphones, so if you want to make a comment or ask a question, we ask that you use the microphone, just raise your hand and get one to you.
I guess I'll start simply. Like, how did you find yourself in those travels? And I apologize for not knowing beforehand. And how long did you get to spend up in that area and in I guess doing research or getting to know some of the community?
I was up there for about a week. I don't remember how I contacted Charlie in Arctic Village. A friend of a friend. I pitched the story to a magazine, and they said it was back when publishing was robust. It was 2001 is what it was. It was September of 2001, so I was almost up there for a lot longer than a week. I came in just a little bit before the attacks. I came back, and it was a great piece of country. But that's 11 years gone by. Already up there, the folks in the village were talking about how the spruce were growing right up into the village, where all their lives there had never been spruce around their village, and just tundra and permafrost. And now the black spruce was growing, and it was growing really fast, like they would be able to see to the horizon, and now they couldn't even see. There were so many trees around them, and that was really a profound little thing. Just the my takeaway was the extreme, just the difference, quality, scale, pace of life, whatever the noun I'm looking for is. Like we're going up the river, and our motor breaks at one point, and just the reliance upon technology, not a iPod kind of technology, but just internal combustion engine. They would not. It'd be a lot harder to be there. They were there for a long time without it. Now it allows them to hang on and cling, during hard times. But Charlie was dinking with the motor, and he had some little screw that he was going to clean the carburetor out or something. He had a little spring, he unwound some little governor or something, and we're floating because the motor's not running. All of a sudden, we're floating downstream down the rapids pretty fast and bouncing off of rocks and spinning around and stuff. And he's just real calm, looking at it and cleaning a little bit of grit out of it and stuff. And I'm such a worrier. I mean, that's what we do in the West. We worry. We're just wired to. It's like we were devolving back to how we were in the savannah. It's like worry, worry, worry. Something's going to get you. Yes, something's going to get us. The future is going to get us. I mean, it's our own making. But so I'm doing my worry thing, and I'm thinking, okay, we're going to hit that rock, and the boat's going to spring, jump, and that piece is going to fall out, and I'm going to miss my flight in 3 days or something. And that's pretty much how it happened. I mean, he hit the rock, and there it went. And we actually, I was able to, frantically, I was able to find it in the shallows with stuff. But it was like, we're just so good at knowing, what to worry about. I was embarrassed, and he was just out in the sun, just kind of looking at it, and like, it didn't matter to him if he got stuck for 3 days. I mean, it really, it was downstream. The village was downstream, just drift downstream without the motor. But I think about that now and again, how worried I was about such a tiny, useless little thing. Would it have mattered if I'd not made it out? I mean, I'd still be here tonight. It was 11 years ago. It's just, I don't know, but I was all hepped up about it at the time. And why did I want to leave? I was having a great time. I just had this schedule that I felt I should keep. What questions did you ask? How did I get off on this?
I was close.
Okay. All right.
It's a slightly different part of the world, but I wonder about the oil sands in Canada and if you can say just a couple of words about it as a geologist and a environmentalist, and if the two things can be reconciled at all.
Yeah. Thanks for asking. There is no reconciliation on the tar sands. I mean, there's I think talked about this in a class earlier this morning. I can justify some oil and gas extraction. I mean, I have to. I use it, but in certain locations, certain conditions. But increasingly, we're moving over into secondary and tertiary recovery. The technology methods. It's not just high grading, cherry picking. The safe, soft sands, shallow sands with that don't need fracturing. The tar sands, James Hansen of NASA said that if that project proceeds unmitigated, it will tip us beyond any ability to compensate or even slow global warming. There will be no mitigation. There'll be no even holding steady. It's the world's largest industrial project. It's a shallow asphalt reservoir the size of Florida up there beneath the boreal forest, and just the simple, the lone act of scraping away the boreal forest to get to the tar sands will tip us beyond any hope of stalling or pausing global warming from losing all the CO2 absorption of the boreal forest. It's the lungs of North America. The oceans are starting to become saturated. The boreal forest is really that is the other hope we have right now, and they're just blading it away to get to the tar sands. And then the steam cleaning process to get the tar melted, to get it out of the sand from the interstitial pores is incredibly inefficient. It takes 4 barrels of oil to steam out 10 barrels of oil, and then these chemicals, these benzenes and all other, who knows what toxins are going into the Athabasca River. The native people who live downstream there are 300% cancer rates from anywhere else in Canada. It's ecocide, it's genocide, and it's for $108 barrel of oil we should be paying $1,500 a barrel for that oil. I'm just making that number up. I don't even want to know the number of what that oil cost, and it's just this shell game, this artificial economy of that we've always lived on. It really is for a long, long time. Since we stopped being hunter-gatherers, we have been living on a false economy, and we're just doubling down, more recklessly and merrily now. And as a geologist who, was trained to look for oil and gas, okay, if it's $20 a barrel, you have to find this much to be able to make the pencil work out. If it's $40 a barrel, you have to find this much. You can find a smaller reservoir. If it's $100 a barrel, you don't have to find a very big field to reach payout. But realizing, with these ecological and thresholds being met and broken, the cost of oil, like the cost of coal, is beyond our wildest imagining, and we're pretending that is what it is. It's not what it is. It's big. Yes.
Thank you. For the excerpt that you were reading about your time in the Arctic Village, what work was that from?
It's from a book called Caribou Rising.
Caribou Rising. Okay, thank you so much.
Sure, you're welcome.
Excuse me. Much has been written about, especially here in New England and Vermont, the loss of family farms, about so much of the land being sold for, broken up and sold for vacation plots and what. I'm not familiar with where you're from. What's the story with ranch lands out there? What is happening to them, and what kind of impact do you see that having long term?
Two things going on in Montana. That's not really. Hopefully nobody. Close enough. There's Yellowstone. So the Continental Divide's here. This is the rangeland, the ranchland, the grassland, the high elevation prairie. It's dewatering. Nobody much lives out there. The grain prices have gone up the last couple of years, so the people who've survived have had a good year, but it's totally depopulating. It's a lot of talks about, not talks, there's a lot of, there are several projects going on assembling big abandoned ranches to create the commons where buffalo can and hunters can go a big ecosystem, a big dream, and I think we'll see it, in the next generation. Western Montana, very forested, very mountainous, heavily glaciated, and I'm up here in the corner. No rangeland. There's not enough sunlight and not enough. There's too much moisture. It's not a grassland. It's a very dense, wet forest, and the big issue up there was logging, clear cutting, and road building, and some pretty big mining issues. So those are the two issues that I find myself involved with most up there, and trying to protect the last places where there aren't roads, trying to keep roads out of them and have them be designated as wilderness. You'll have these in my valley, about 1 million acres. There's a constellation of about 14 roadless areas, and I'm trying to get them protected as wilderness and connect them, and then protect some land over in Canada and also in Idaho to have kind of a mass. And some other conservationists are working on protecting lands here that connect this ecosystem to this one, the Selway Bitterroot, which then goes down into Yellowstone. So it's just, I don't know, it's just like gardening, really. You just what do you want to plant here? You want grizzlies here? You want caribou here? You need to take care of the soil, not over harvest. I don't know. It's funny what we wrap our brains around and spend our lives on. It's gorgeous country. It's really, really gorgeous.
I'm just curious if you had the opportunity to travel many Arctic or subarctic rivers in your travels.
Not many. I spent some time on the Taku in British Columbia, where it comes out into Alaska, and over on the other side of the divide, the Muskoka-Chika. Really, really wild about that. I love that country, but I'm not a river person. I don't like to fish, and I don't like being in boats. Water makes me nervous. But
the Sierra Club is in various parts of the country funding a program called Resilient Habitats, trying to link lands, as you have demonstrated there, further north, so that animals that need to respond to climate change have avenues that are protected that will allow them to move further north. And in Vermont, one of the ways that they're hoping that this can come about is through the creation of town forests. And I can see how that could help link, but I could also see towns in economic desperation might see that protecting this forest isn't bringing in any income, but if they sold it to a developer, maybe we could get out of our slump. And I just wondered what your take might be on Vermont's approach.
I'm not familiar with the town. I haven't heard that phrase. I've heard community forest, which I'm assuming is kind of the same thing. A lot of the paperland, industrial timberland liquidation is being purchased by conservation groups and being converted to community forests. It's all in the charter. You've got to set up those covenants, those sideboards from the beginning to protect us against ourselves. It's a good idea, but you're right. Humans are going to be humans. In any, Jimmy's not, a noble savage. He's going to, if his folks are hungry, he's going to do what it takes to feed them. And you can get into values of, okay, how much do you need to eat and stuff like that? How much do you need to come out of the slump? But no, the town forests have got to get the language in on the front end, or eventually will come to pass that there will be an administration or a generation with lesser conservation values, for sure. There were some hands up. Did y'all's questions get answered? Yes. Thank you. It was weird. It was like a school of fish. Everybody's hand was right here in this.
I was actually just a little more curious about what you were saying with kind of a person who's at the center of these pyramids. And I don't typically think of a human as being, kind of like a keystone human almost.
Right.
And I wondered if you could comment a little bit more on that, and whether you've met multiple of these types of people. I know that you said they were kind of rare, but what kind of role have you gotten from meeting people like this? And
I don't know. It's just a suspicion. And I'm not even saying that it's what I think or believe. It's more what I wonder. I wouldn't say that I'm right, but it would be quite an individual to be in such a here. The way I think about us is I drew this diagram in one of the classes this morning. Here's the tree of life. Here's the Precambrian, here's the Cambrian, here's the stromatolites, here's the Devonian, Ordovician, and so forth, Paleozoic, and then here we are. Say here's primates 1 million years ago, running out of room, and then here 180,000 years ago, here we are. This experiment. I mean, there's nothing like us. There's, other than the great apes here, 1 million years ago, there's nothing like us. I mean, this is, what are we? What are we? I'm not saying why are we here. I'm saying what makes a human? What a strange experiment. I mean, how in the world did we get here? I mean, we've got nothing. I mean, how do we survive? How do we get here? We're way out here on this branch off of the tree of life, and everything else has got this, incredibly deep ancestry and incredibly deep membership in the club of life, in the tree of life. And so, I see what you're saying. How can something so unvetted, untested, occupy anything in here in this center flow? But we did come from there. We carry. I mean, 97, 99% of gorilla DNA is ours. I mean, we came from that center ancient column. So it's not impossible to imagine that there are folks who just somehow have some allegiance. Now, if you were to cut this tree in half and look down on it, that's what I'm talking about. That there are people who are more somehow have some kind of allegiance to that, and I don't even know in what way. I'm not even talking about genetically. I just don't know it, almost spiritually or something, rather than being out here floating at this perimeter or out here on the radial spine, this thing, way out here, which is where most of us sense that we are. I think I certainly do. I don't know why we're here, or I don't think we have. I don't know. I worry. But it's just I just sense that there are people who are capable of fitting gracefully an unbroken ecosystem. I'm not one of them, but I see them now and again, and I don't necessarily mean that they have great woodcraft. I mean, they could fit emotionally, spiritually, intellectually, physically. Just some people fit the old world, or that healthy world, but not many. And I think they probably have value to us, because I think more and more of us are not fitting we're out there on the centrifugal force. It's like a merry-go-round. Again, looking at this perimeter, when you start getting motion going fast, it's really hard to hold on to the edges here, but if you're not so much there in the center. We're getting away from the science, aren't we? Okay. Yes?
Your circular diagram with something in the middle brings to mind a letter to the editor at the latest issue of Science. Have you seen it?
No.
This is about conservation in Ethiopia. And the thing in the middle are, I don't know whether they're hermitages or monasteries, but they have their own forests. And according to this letter to the editor, essentially they're the only forests left in Ethiopia. And the letter commends collaboration between science and religion in these places.
Well, it's fascinating, and you really can't talk about our species without getting pretty much into spirituality. That may be what defines us, apart from the tree of life. I don't know that dolphins and whales and grizzlies have spiritual lives, but that may be the one thing that we have that everything else does. That may be our loneliness. I don't know. It may be why we're here. I don't know. But I think anytime you start talking about this stuff, you kind of creep in that direction. But back to your question about like Jimmy being there in the middle. this is something that bothers me. Again, I can worry about it. How many acres does it take to support a keystone species like Jimmy? Somebody who shoots swans, who shoots bighorn sheep, Dall sheep, who shoots muskox, who shoots, blammo, 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 a quaternary predator. How much? It takes a lot of space, a lot of sunlight, a lot of biomass. And then he's supporting his little village. I mean, if he's gone, they're gone. We're talking about one person. But how many acres does it take? Okay, and then do the math. Okay, if you want to have that in the world be sustainable, maybe the world could only hold 12 Jimmies. I don't know, The math doesn't bode well for us. And again, not saying everybody has to be a Jimmy. It's kind of a pretty neat order to just have one guy go out and get the meat, but still, back to like that monastery. I mean, yeah, they can do their thing there, but it's just, is it practical at a scale level? No, it's not. There's just too many of us with too big of an appetite. That's just the bottom line. But I think there's something important going on, when you meet people like that throwbacks or whatever, back to how it was before we messed it up. But no, it's always been messed up. It's just not a sustainable venture. Our footprints are very heavy. But here we are.
Rick, I want to thank you for very wonderful and amazing and thought-provoking talk, and I think we're already thinking about how to get you back here again to spend enough time with you.
Thank you.
So thank you so much. And some of you, I'm sure, want to come down and meet Rick.